All right, everyone, it's time for another exciting episode of The Democrats Are All Messed Up with the polling analysis here. We've got three new polls, actually, that I hadn't analyzed on the old aggregate that I was using in the last time I spoke about the Dem primaries. Biden is still out ahead by a fairly large margin. In the aggregate, it's much more rosy for him. It could be that he's about to have a slide in the aggregate, but I mean, he's still the front runner in every poll here, and it's gotten to the point where his eye starts bleeding up on stage. He obviously barely even knows how to answer questions. That sort of thing doesn't seem to slow him down. He seems to be stubbornly around 30 points within the primaries. That's enough to give him the nomination. It could be a situation where Biden coasts to a victory in enough early primaries because of a packed field, where he becomes a shoo-in, sweeps Super Tuesday, becomes nominated, even though he's clearly unqualified. And he is clearly unqualified. You put him up against Trump, it's going to be hilarious. It's going to be spectacular watching it. I'm going to have fun. It means no skin off my back because I'll probably end up having to vote for Trump anyway. Look, Biden, even though he's one of the less qualified at this point because he's clearly demented and falling apart, is one of the more sane as far as what he's proposing. He's the only one in the entire Democratic field, I believe, that's not pushing the lie of so-called free healthcare. He's pushing a system where people can get a basic program through the government at a direct subsidized level, which is perfectly fine under the existing system. It'll cost a little bit more, but it's negligible. Everyone else is talking about my free shit. Everyone else has basically taken Bernie Sanders' basic idea and warped it out of all boundaries and said, well, yeah, Bernie Sanders is nice for offering you free shit, for offering you free health care and debt forgiveness and other taxpayer-funded goodies. Yeah, a plethora of good things from your fellow Americans involuntarily stolen from them. But I want to offer you 10 times more because who fucking cares? If we run out of money from taxes, we'll just print more money and who gives a shit? Who into economics? Nobody up on stage, apparently. But let me look into these polls. And again, we don't have anything new from New Hampshire, Iowa. Well, I think there's one new Iowa poll that shows Biden ahead, but I think it's Monmouth, so I ignore it, even though it shows what I would expect to see. No, I don't trust their polling service, not after their massive-ass outlier from last week where they said Biden was, at 19? Some crazy shit. They really flubbed on that one. Trust me, it was an outlier. Anyway, we got three new polls here. We've got IBD, Politico, and The Economist. All three show Biden as the front-runner, but they show different degrees of front-runningness. If you believe Politico, he's way out in front by double digits. Is that sensible? Feasibly. When I'm looking at these numbers, though, it would show Elizabeth Warren around where she has been, whereas the other two show her rising up into the low 20s. This one, conversely, though, would show Sanders differentiated from where the other polls seem to be showing him, other than the Emerson poll at 24. He would have risen up to 20. So I would have to believe that Biden had slumped quite a bit and Sanders had actually risen up. Now, that makes sense on its face. I'll tell you why. Oftentimes, and you can look at this visually, if you actually look at the numbers here graphed out, you can see sometimes one candidate rises and another candidate falls, and they do so in tandem. It's one person stealing vote share from another. We've seen this, we saw this early on when the race was less packed, when they were the two only main candidates before Warren surged ahead and managed to arguably rise up now to a close second, or at least riding just ahead of Bernie. Sanders and Biden did this. They were interchanging votes. Warren has managed to steal some support from Biden. It seems some support from Kamala Harris. She might have taken some, it seems, from Sanders, although less. Sanders actually has been remarkably stable. If you look at his aggregate, he's run around 15 points now since I'm just looking at this graph. It takes up more than the entire screen here since April. For a very long time, he's been very stable. Since that point where Biden peaked, he's also been roughly stable. He's found his floor, by the way, Biden. It's somewhere around 25 or thereabouts, 25, 26. If you start seeing poll numbers for Biden that are below that, that's when he has to look out. Otherwise, though, if he remains at that level, the fact that the bottom part of the field is so crowded is going to keep anyone else from competing. The only standout, the only person at this point, if things remain on the same trajectory, the only person I would expect who had a chance would be Sanders, and that's because he's the only other person who's ahead in any of the polls from the early states, other than a badly dated poll from, what was it? I think it was Iowa for Elizabeth Warren. You've had several polls since then. Biden's back on top in a fairly significant way. Now, of course, polling also had Trump ahead of Ted Cruz in Iowa in 2016. You have to be aware of that fact. You can see it flubbed simply because there's not enough polling. We need more polling, especially from Iowa and New Hampshire. Then we can tell you exactly who's going to be on top. Politico has Biden way out ahead. The other two polls have him out ahead by a much more mild margin, 4 points and 4 points respectively. In both cases, ahead of Warren. That makes sense to me too. The problem I have with those two polls, just on its face, and one of them is Economist, and usually I weight that more heavily than other polls. I take it more seriously because they seem to always ride closer to the aggregate and the real number. They do a very good job with their methodology. I'd say the problem that I have with that is that both of these polls show Warren having pulled significantly ahead of her aggregate. Her aggregate's 17.6. Both of these show her far ahead of that. Whereas the Politico poll, which normally I wouldn't weight as highly, is riding the aggregate almost exactly. 16 points compared to 17.6 for her aggregated number. It's also closer in regards to Biden. I'd have him at 32. His aggregate's around 30.1. As far as the rest of the field no longer matters. At this later stage in the race, now that we're getting on in months, everyone's in who's probably going to be in. I don't think you're going to see a spoiler. No, I don't believe that Hillary will get in at the last moment. I guess his thing is that they're expecting Biden drops out and Hillary gets in. I think if Biden dropped out, Elizabeth Warren would become Joe Biden and become the nominee, which would be even funnier than Biden running. Like, it's great. There's a 90% chance that the person facing off against Trump will be slipping into demented insanity by the time of the general election. It's going to be hilarious. I can't wait. It'll be like watching George W. Bush run, only as a Democrat and 20 years older than George W. was. I think he was in his 50s. He wasn't that old when he ran. He aged very ungracefully during his presidency, by the way. Trump hasn't really aged at all, other than, I guess he applies a little more bronzer now. Watching Elizabeth Warren, though, and that would be most of the rest of the 10% chance there, watching her run would be funny. Because Trump gets to call her Pocahontas, which would be funny, at least for a while, although it's not substantive, let's be honest. The fact that she lied about her ethnicity for so long, it's going to come back to bite her. And the fact that she's very waspish and she has a track record of being almost right-wing on some issues, and then in the last couple of years setting the stage to run as a progressive and now going way, way far left to the point where she looks like Bernie Sanders, only, female. Elizabeth Warren pretends to be what Bernie Sanders actually is. Which is why the Bernie bros and the Elizabeth Warrenites don't get along very well together. The fact that they're strangling each other and each preventing the other from challenging Biden is hilarious. Because whichever one of them ends up being that consistent runner-up, like through Super Tuesday, one of them might drop out and say, well, the gig is up, I can't do it. Now, at that point, even with proportional allocation of delegates, the lower part of the field's gone. Where does their support go? I'm extremely interested. The one thing I think that could stop Biden, imagine that after the first 3 states, everyone else in the race drops out. Where does the support go to? A coalition of them could get together and decide Biden can't win, and they're all universally backing Sanders or Warren. Warren more likely than the other. If that were to happen, then they could challenge him. It would look like a revolt within the Democratic Party, and they could do a press conference and shit. But when I'm looking at the polls, and I know that polls on their own should never be trusted, but the aggregated number is at least somewhat sensible here. Biden is still by far the frontrunner. There has still never been a single point in polling history in this primary, and this was never even the case with Trump. Trump has to wait after he gets in for almost a month before he becomes a heavy hitter within the race. Joe Biden has consistently led the field for months and months before even announcing his candidacy. It's completely different in that sense from 2016. There's never been a moment at which Biden has been behind. There's never been a moment he hasn't been the front runner. The fact is that we've got to wait for more polling now as well, because the CNN town hall for him ultimately was a disaster. He looked confused and befuddled, and his eyes started bleeding. And even if it's not a major medical condition, when you're 75, 76 years old, it looks major. Your eye bleeding looks major to the public. They saw it on live TV during the CNN town hall. And people briefly talked about it before all the tech firms ran interference and they started farting and pissing their pants in anxiety trying to cover for their golden boy Joe Biden. They still think he can beat Trump. That just shows you there's no grand conspiracy, because if there was, they would know better. There'd have to be some extreme levels of voter fraud to get Joe Biden in as the president of the United States. He's got basically no chance. His chance of winning in the Dem primaries is still high, only because he's been such a consistent front runner. He's got the money and the corporate backing and stuff. People piled on him early, assuming he'd be coronated. They piled on early, not realizing how fucked up he was. And then, like, within a couple of months, they're like, whoops, I think we might have made a mistake. And a lot of them, through the backdoor channels, were, I think, funding the Buttigieg campaign or the Beto O'Rourke campaign. They've both crashed and burned. Look at the polls. When somebody peaks and recedes, they typically don't go back up unless there's a major paradigm shift within the field. But we're not expecting that till probably, at least the first couple of states are in. By then, Joe Biden may have sealed the deal. If he wins New Hampshire, he knocks Sanders out same day. Sanders will deflate like a popped balloon. And Elizabeth Warren's not going to grab up his support. Be better if, ironically, for Joe Biden, for fear of the fact that Sanders might drop out and endorse Elizabeth Warren, if after New Hampshire if he loses, Biden should hope that he does really well in Iowa, scrapes by, narrowly loses in New Hampshire, and then goes on to gobble up South Carolina and Nevada, keeping Sanders in the race through Super Tuesday, hoping for a brokered convention that he can't have any leverage in. That's about all. Peace out.